G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar on the Voice to Parliament Handbook with authors Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As long-time listeners and viewers will know, days and times for Australia Institute webinars do vary, so head on over to australiainstitute.org.au for all our upcoming webinars and events. And just a few tips about Zoom to help things run smoothly today if you're joining us for the first time. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can type in questions for our guests today. You should also be able to upvote other people's questions and make comments on their questions as well. So if you see a good one, please upvote it. That'll help me to find it. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we will boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on the Australia Institute website and our YouTube channel later today. And we're also going to turn it into an episode of our Follow the Money podcast, so you can send it out to your friends and family as well. So thank you so much for joining us today for what we are hoping is Australia's biggest book club. More than 3,500 of you are registered today to discuss this book, The Voice to Parliament Handbook. I'm not sure if 3,500 makes us the biggest book club, but it's got to surely put us close to it. So thank you for all your interest today. Hopefully you have ordered or bought a copy of the handbook from your local bookstore. The Voice to Parliament Handbook is an easy to follow guide for the millions of Australians around the country who have expressed support for the Uluru Statement from the Heart, but want to better understand what a voice to Parliament actually means. We've got a special offer for Australia Institute supporters to order their copy, which we'll put in the chat, but I'm delighted to introduce the two authors and our guests today. Thomas Mayo is a Torres Strait Islander man born on Larrakia country in Darwin. He's the National Indigenous Officer of the MUA, and as an islander growing up on the mainland, he learned to hunt traditional foods with his father and to island dance from the Darwin community of Torres Strait Islanders. He's a signatory to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and has been a leading advocate since its inception in May 2017. He's the chairperson of the NT Indigenous Labour Network, advises the Diversity Council of Australia and the From the Heart campaign, and he's an executive member of the Northern Territory Trades and Labour Council. He's previously written 5 other books published by Hardy Grant and has articles and essays published in The Guardian, Griffith Review and the Sydney Morning Herald, and we're delighted he can join us today. And of course, Kerry O'Brien is one of Australia's most respected journalists and has won 6 Walkley Awards, including the Gold Walkley and the Walkley for Outstanding Leadership. He's covered all the big historic Indigenous issues of his time, including land rights, deaths in custody, Mabo, the Stolen Generations Inquiry, the birth and death of Atsik, the intervention, and the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And he was a member of the eminent panel advising the Queensland government on a path to treaty. Thank you both so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Thomas, if I can start with you. You are, as I said, a signatory to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which called for voice and makarrata for truth-telling and agreement-making. Let's start at the beginning. What does the voice mean to you?
Yeah, well, the voice to me is it's about being heard. It's about having a say as Indigenous people that decisions are made about all the time. The voice is a consensus position. It comes from the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart is the culmination of a lot of lessons in a long history of struggle, where we have had many other statements and petitions and all have been dismissed and ignored. We've had many, in all of those statements and petitions, there's a consistent call for a voice to be heard, to have political representation. There's also a long history of voices established where we haven't waited, as groups of humans with a common interest do. They organise a structure for which to choose representation and have a say in a coherent and effective way. And we've done that many times, including where we've had benevolent governments that have established, representative bodies And so the lesson into the Uluru Statement there is that we must do something different, because every other time we have begun to be loud enough to influence decisions made about us, that a government comes along and silences our voice. The Uluru Statement also takes the lesson that of those petitions and statements that have been dismissed and ignored in the past, and puts a proposition or an invitation to the Australian people to walk with us. And as I said, consistent with all those other times, we're calling for a voice. So, I think it's a matter of fairness for me as well. To go back to the beginning of what I was saying, decisions are made about us all the time. There is the race power in the Constitution. There's this misinformation out there that 1967, the referendum back then, removed race from our Constitution, and that's false. All it did was give the federal parliament the power to use that power, and they have used that power to our detriment at times. And so a voice is to establish the means for us to influence those decisions and start to get some healing in this country, and importantly, recognition, because you can't recognise someone if you're not going to listen to them.
And Thomas, if I can just follow up on that, really one of the essential things from the Uluru Statement from the Heart was that they First Nations communities really rejected any kind of just a symbolic gesture or recognition. You were really after something much more meaningful, and that was really part of this invitation and why it's a voice to Parliament that needs to be in the Constitution. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, Ebony, this is an important piece of history for people to understand and context to the call for a voice. In 2015, there was the Kirribilli Statement, and it was when 39 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders called for a meeting with the Prime Minister and opposition leader in a crisis, what was essentially a crisis, when, for years to that point, things had been getting worse, the gap widening, certainly targets not being met to try and improve the lives of Indigenous people. We saw the Northern Territory intervention, for example, which was just a political gamesmanship that was very harmful to Indigenous people. And we know today for a massive amount of taxpayer dollars really made things worse. We saw, under Tony Abbott, hundreds of millions of dollars cut from frontline community services important to families, young families, babies that had fetal alcohol syndrome, for example, and you see the ripple-on effects today with the youth crime rates and incarceration rates. That's a result of these decisions that are made purely to try and get a boost in the polls. And so the Kirribilli meeting called for, firstly, for, as you said, a substantive form of recognition, not a constitutional recognition that is merely symbolic. And in the words of those leaders and in the Kirribilli Statement, a form of recognition that provides our people with greater fairness. And essentially, that is the result of what came out of the Kirribilli Statement, which was the establishment of the Referendum Council that ran 12 regional dialogues covering the entire continent and adjacent islands, that elected delegates to come together at Uluru. And we made the Uluru Statement from the heart. And the form of recognition that we seek is substantive, that will give us greater fairness, and that's a voice.
Kerry, if I can come to you next, you're obviously a veteran of Australian politics over many years. What does the voice mean to you, and why have you chosen to get involved and write this book?
Ebony, I'd prefer to think of myself as a veteran journalist, a veteran of journalism rather than a veteran of politics. But and I'm coming from Bundjalung country today, where sovereignty has never been ceded. The fact is, in well over 50 years of journalism, as you said in your introduction, I've seen all of the highs and the lows of contemporary Indigenous history in Australia, post-colonial. And I have seen promises made and promises broken. I've seen many forms of previous voices of Indigenous people to Parliament and to government. I've seen the frictions between those Indigenous people representing their communities and largely white bureaucrats and largely white politicians, many of whom had never visited the communities that they were designing policies for. And I've seen the inevitable failures mingled with perhaps a little more than a handful of successes, but the successes have been incremental. The failures have been at times profound, as evidenced in those gaps that Thomas referred to. I have seen racism close up in its ugliest forms in various parts of Australia. And the sad truth is that you haven't had to scratch too far below the surface to find it. And it's not confined to the bush. It's not confined to outback areas or to regional Australia, and it's not confined to any one state. And I'm very careful not to cry racism for the sake of it or to overuse the term. You don't have to be honest. It's there. And I have seen it from my time as a very young journalist, and it had its effect on me. Not in a kind of naive way. I was reporting in a hard-edged way. I've always sought to report things factually and to be a part of truthful public debate. But I can't help but have been affected by what I've seen, including the ways in which Indigenous people who have reached out for support and partnership over decades and have been left disappointed on so many occasions. I can actually sympathise with and understand those Indigenous people who are sceptical about the voice, because they have been promised so many things so often and they have been let down so many times. The huge difference, I think, with this attempt at a greater fairness and a greater harmony between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians is that this concept has come from Indigenous people. This is not an invention of Canberra. This is not an invention of politicians. This has come from Indigenous Australians, and Thomas has said, representing the whole nation. It was broken down into many parts. People very carefully selected in a way that ensured proper representation around all of those Indigenous. This was Indigenous voices to the people, really. They've asked the Parliament to facilitate this referendum, but they are placing their expression and their hope in front of all of the people of Australia. That is the huge difference between this occasion and opportunities in the past. And how could I help but be caught up by it?
Yeah. Thomas, I want to pick up on what Kerry has said there, that invitation to all Australians. It's not an invitation just to politicians to do this, but of course, this is with the Parliament at the moment. They will pass the laws that will enable this referendum. I wonder if you can just take our audience through the proposition that they're going to be voting on later this year. What is the basic element of the voice to Parliament? Why is it necessary?
Yeah, thank you, Ebony. Look, what we're voting on, the question is quite simple. It's basically, a proposed law. Do we agree that we should recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples through a voice? The provision itself merely establishes that there shall be, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples, 1, there shall be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. 2, that voice may make representations to the Parliament and executive government on matters relating to Indigenous peoples. And 3, the Parliament decides the rest. So we're voting basically on the principle here that Indigenous people should be recognised and that we should listen to them about the matters that relate to them. And it really is that simple. That's what we're considering at this referendum.
And to follow up on that, we have seen pushback from certain elements of the No campaign, talking about what the voice will and won't do. But as you've just described it there, and as it's being put, the Prime Minister, I think, described it as quite a modest proposal, essentially. What's your response to some of those people kind of overblowing what this will do and the kind of impact that it might have on government?
Well, I just want to say to the Australian people, and I think we should all ask our fellow Australians to look past the fear-mongering that is happening and look for the truth. And this book is very much about trying to give people a small, easy, can keep it in your back pocket. You can read it in less time than it takes to watch a movie. Something that just helps people to be able to do that. There's these, I've explained what it simply is. It's simply guaranteeing that Indigenous people will have a representative body, a voice, and that we can make representations on matters that relate to us. It is not a third chamber to Parliament. It's not going to govern anyone. It's not going to control funding like ATSIC did. It's not going to have a right to veto. None of those things are in the provision that I outlined in a matter of a few seconds. It's 93 words. Look past all of that fear-mongering and just, this is actually a simple thing to communicate with people once you get through all of that. The truth is, again, it's a representative body that's guaranteed by the Constitution that can make representations on matters that affect Indigenous people. That's advisory to the Parliament. Can't force the Parliament to do anything, but the strength of it comes through that it is genuinely grassroots, that it is representatives chosen from our communities that understand our culture, that live and breathe the issues every day. And when they're able to come together regularly, which we can't do now in a proper resource way, but when we choose representatives and they can come together regularly, hold debates and discussions about the best possible solutions to policy and legislation, and they present that to the Parliament in a transparent way that our own people see, and that the Australian people also see these solutions being offered to the Parliament. That's where the strength of this is the accountability of this, is the coherency of it.
I can see we've got nearly 2,000 people joining us live today. Thank you so much for joining us. We will go to questions from the audience in a little while. And I did just want to flag that Thomas will be reading the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full towards the end of this webinar. So please make sure you stick around for that. And if you've got questions for Thomas or Kerry, please pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Kerry, coming to you off Thomas's point there about what the voice will do and obviously what it won't do. We have seen some of those naysayers, but part of the point of putting this in the Constitution is so that the voice to Parliament can't be just abolished at the whim of government like so many other attempts have been. There's a chapter on kind of the history leading up to the voice in this that you wrote. Can you just tell us a little bit about some of the history leading us up to this moment?
Absolutely, Ebony. There were, as Thomas, I think, said close to the start of this discussion, that there have always been Indigenous activists endeavouring to have their voices heard, representing Indigenous communities on the most basic of rights and expectations, but thwarted. After the 1967 referendum, Harold Holt was Prime Minister, and about 2 months after that referendum, the most resounding yes vote in the history of our federation, somebody asked the minister who was going to be responsible for this new responsibility of establishing Indigenous affairs, Indigenous policies. Somebody asked this minister, Seb Barnes, what he was going to do now, and he said, "I don't know." So, although what they did was a terrific step forward, it was driven largely from outside by Indigenous people. That's where the pressure came from, with some white support. There wasn't that much pressure inside Parliament, but at least it was bipartisan. And the first voice, the first Indigenous voice that Harold Holt established was 3 people inside his own office to give him advice on Indigenous matters, and they were all white men. That was the first voice, and it wasn't Indigenous. And it was kind of classic of the tradition and the mentality and the custom and the thinking in Canberra, in Parliament House and in government, which was, we know best. Yeah, we'll open up dialogue, we'll listen to you, but we know best. And when Gough Whitlam started the first real Indigenous voice, which was a small group, 41 Indigenous people who were selected from within their communities, there were immediate frictions between those voices and their white minister, who they answered to. and the bureaucrats who really drove so much of the policy. But nonetheless, they were the first real voice. Malcolm Fraser comes in after Gough is sacked. He fiddles with it. He reduces the numbers. He narrows the parameters for selection. He goes. Bob Hawke comes in. He takes a while. He gets rid of it, but it takes a while for him to put a replacement in. When he does, it's ATSIC, which is really quite a big step forward. Indigenous people, it was 2 tiers. The regional tier was selected from within communities, and they were councillors who then selected the people who would represent their 16. So it was 2 layers. They also had a big hand in service delivery, and there was a bureaucracy backing that, all supplied and all created democratically through the Parliament and through government. And there was some criticisms about ATSIC. There were some stumbles. There were a few governance issues, and there were some criticisms. But instead of allowing ATSIC to grow and to evolve and to establish itself with some kind of institutional stability, the change of government, John Howard comes along. He'd voted against it from opposition when it was first proposed. He'd described it as a black parliament. Its days were numbered, although it took time. He only really moved against it, although everybody knew that he didn't like it. He only really moved against it after Mark Latham, as the leader of the Labor Party, declared that Labor would support the abolition of ATSIC. So John Howard established very quickly a 3-person review chaired by a former Liberal Attorney General, John Howard's own side of politics. Everyone expected that review would propose that ATSIC be abolished. Surprisingly, they didn't. They saw virtue in its continued presence. They said ATSIC needs to stay. It just needs to strengthen its roots with regional Indigenous Australia. John Howard abolished it with the support of Labor. So since then, we've seen a checkerboard of different voices, some heard to some degree, some not heard, but the end result has been the same, Ebony. There has been no sense of permanence, no sense of continuity, and therefore the policies, as often as not, have failed. And where they've succeeded, invariably it's because Indigenous people have been listened to, and Indigenous people on the ground in their communities have been directly engaged in the delivery. People who understand traditions and customs, who know what's going to work, who know how things are going to be received, who know how to communicate. And we've got a short chapter in the book from Marcia Langton and Fiona Stanley, which highlights several areas where there were clear successes and why.
Yeah, Kerry, if I can just follow up on that, I was really interested in that chapter. We've spoken to Professor Fiona Stanley in the past, particularly about the role of Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations during the COVID crisis, where on the smell of an oily rag, they really protected communities far better even than the Australian health system protected everybody else. And I think we're world leading amongst First Nations communities in the health outcomes during COVID. And that's partly what they go into in that chapter. Could you just tell us a little bit more about some of those examples that they talk about?
Well, COVID was a terrific example because it was, in fact, the protections in Indigenous communities were shaped and delivered largely by Indigenous people. As I understand it, not a single Indigenous death. And yet these were amongst the most vulnerable people in Australia in terms of exposure to COVID. Now, that is an outstanding example. Another example that they touch on is the Koori courts, where Indigenous elders play a very significant part, where, again, the results speak for themselves. This is a classic example where Indigenous ideas, Indigenous proposals have been listened to, courts that have been seen to reduce recidivism. I think you talked about health in prenatal and postnatal care, where it is Indigenous, it is skilled Indigenous people advising pregnant women or women who have just given birth in a language that they can understand. And by, I don't mean necessarily literally language, but in communication that reflects a shared understanding of Indigenous tradition and custom and so on. So where you have that, you see a reduction in problems, in health problems, all the way up to death around birth. So you look at these examples, and I think you can also say with some degree of confidence that the intervention that Thomas referred to, which was far more disastrous than any instances of success that people might be able to pluck out of a broad picture of failure. And you've just got to look to communities today to see where things failed. I think there's an argument that if there had been a voice to Parliament with status and with respect from the Parliament and from the government back in 2007, there would not have needed to be an intervention. There could not have been a justification made for intervention. I don't think that's far-fetched at all.
Mm. Thomas, coming back to you, you've described what the voice is. This is what's currently before the Parliament, about to be before the whole of Australia. We're going to have a referendum where people will have the choice to vote yes or to vote no. We're seeing a big no campaign at the moment with various arguments, and I can see some of those arguments popping up in the questions. But one thing I just wanted to clarify is, I mean, this is an advisory body to the Parliament. That's really just not at all an unusual thing for parliaments to do, have advisory bodies give them advice on all sorts of things. Why do you think there's so much pushback against this proposal when it is indeed so modest and so straightforward?
Look, I don't think there's any logic or factual arguments against this from those that are spreading that. I'm not denying that some Australians are listening to these arguments and are influenced by them, but at its source, these arguments have no truth to them. They are designed to fearmonger, and they are designed to confuse. And this is where you see this contradiction where on one hand you have the No campaign saying that this will have that this is too powerful, that it's going to cause chaos, and Indigenous people are going to take your backyards like we haven't heard that one before, or that we're going to decide where our submarines are going to be parked and what the interest rates should be and what the parking tickets should be, and all these spurious allegations about what the voice is going to be able to do, which are completely false. And the contradiction is at the same time they're saying it's not going to make a difference for Indigenous people. It's not going to change anything. Look, this is really advisory to Parliament. It will not be able to force the Parliament to do anything. It hasn't got that sort of power, and Indigenous people wouldn't be so stupid to ask for that sort of power with that unique opportunity that we had to come together at Uluru and put an invitation to the Australian people. But what it can do, what it is coherent advice coming from the people that are affected most. I do hope this is difficult to get through to Australians that hear very little, other than what they might see on Facebook. But the only way we're going to get over that, and I saw one of the questions in the chat is about how the media isn't helping. The only way we're going to get through that, the only way that we're going to win is by us having these conversations with everybody that we can influence, and helping them to understand what this is.
And
Ebony, sorry, I just want to quickly follow up on what Thomas is talking about there. One of the sort of anecdotal things that I hear, and it might be on radio interviews, it might just be talking to the public, it might be sometimes when we're talking at events, and someone will, there is this inference, there is this suggestion that somehow or other this voice to Parliament and to government is going to open up some quote unquote new gravy train, like as if Indigenous affairs has been a skate ride of privilege, rather than the opposite, which is the truth, that Indigenous people proportionately are the most marginalised group of identifiable group of Australians, the most marginalised. And yet somehow or other, it's never said straight out, it's an implication. There is an implication that somehow this is going to lead to much more money flowing into Indigenous communities, into Indigenous hands. For a start, Indigenous people will not have a say on money. They will only have a say on the shaping of policy. That comes from the Parliament. That comes from our democratically elected people in the Parliament. And that's where the oversight is as well. So it's a really small number of people that we're talking about. The co-design group that spoke to nearly 10,000 Indigenous people and had 110 further consultations after the Uluru Statement around Indigenous communities, urban, regional and rural in Australia. And as they drilled down and got a better idea of what Indigenous people themselves wanted, this is Marcia Langton and Tom Karma's group, and they've come up with a proposal for 24 people to represent the voice selected from urban, regional and rural communities around Australia, with a few extra numbers amongst that 24 for the remote areas and for the Torres Strait Islands. That is their proposal. And there is a similar proposal for a local voice and a regional voice, and the states would get engaged in that as well. These are really small numbers, but it's the Parliament that will determine that. It's the government will make it will come up with a model that it will put to the Parliament. There'll be intense debate about it. It'll go through a whole committee process. It'll go through both houses of Parliament before the final shapes of the voice emerge. And then right into the indefinite future, it's the Parliament and the Parliament only that will have the power ultimately to determine whether the voice is changed or not. And they will be basing that change on how effective the voice is. And if some hostile government comes in at some point in the future that doesn't like, for whatever reason, Indigenous Australians having a voice, for God's sake, why, I don't know, but let's say they did, they would be judged by us, the people, who have in the referendum in the first place, who will have voted yes, the most powerful expression of democracy this country has at its disposal, the people speaking, not the politicians, the people speaking. The voice will have a moral and a political authority when it puts its proposals to government, but it will be judged on the effectiveness and the quality of its advice, and ultimately it will be judged on when we see the gaps in inequality closing, when we see this country genuinely becoming a fairer society, when we see this country genuinely becoming more united.
Ebony, if I could just add, just briefly, on Thursday and Friday, I was in Burunga. Burunga is a small Aboriginal community near Katherine in the Northern Territory, a remote Aboriginal community where the Burunga Statement came from. That called for a voice which led to the establishment of ATSIC, and we've talked about that and how Howard opposed it and then destroyed it when he got into government. And what came from the Thursday and Friday gathering at Burunga, which was the 4 land councils in the Northern Territory, the Northern Land Council, Central Land Council, Anandulyakwa Land Council, and Tiwi Land Council. So, over 100 representatives from the most remote communities in the Northern Territory. They made what is called the Burunga Voice Declaration, and it touches on. It was really all about asking Australians again to support this Yes campaign, and one of the parts of it talk about how we don't want to see our voice, our ability to have a say, taken away at the stroke of a pen again. And it was a really powerful coming together of those Indigenous communities, reiterating our support.
If you're just joining us, we are discussing the Voice to Parliament Handbook with authors Kerry O'Brien and Thomas Mayo. This is available in all good bookstores, and if you're in the chat, we've got an offer from Booktopia for Australia Institute supporters, so you can order it today if you don't already have your copy. We've got more than 2,000 people live with us today. Thank you so much. We're going to go to questions from the audience now. It's very helpful for me as host if you can upvote questions that you would like answered. That will help me find the best ones. So I want to begin with a question from Penny Orban. Kerry, I might put this one to you. Penny asks, what can we say to people who are demanding details before they vote yes?
Well, the simple answer is that what we, the people, are being asked to decide is whether or not we are prepared to recognise 65,000 plus years of Indigenous civilisation and history as a foundational aspect of this country's history. And secondly, that because of that unique history and presence in this country at the foundation of this country, that 65,000 years of custodianship, apart from anything else, looking after the continent and its adjacent islands, that they will have a permanent place on the political landscape and on the institutional landscape, with the responsibility only for providing advice to the Parliament on behalf of Indigenous grassroots communities, those Indigenous communities who have elected a small number of Indigenous people who will make up that voice of advice. So the one thing, A, there is the recognition, very important and fundamental, and then B, permanence, and the chance for this special institution representing this special part of this country's history with the overall goal of redressing the deep imbalance of justice and fairness in this country to this marginalised group of Australians who once essentially owned this continent, to actually guarantee that they will have an ongoing voice of advice and representation to government and the Parliament, so that they can hopefully influence policies that will impact back on them. That is the fundamental of it. We are not being asked to say how big or how small or how this or how that or how much money that the voice, the resources that it would have at its disposal. But I would suggest, comparative to the other resources of government, it's pretty humble. But that it will have that permanence, and it will have a chance to cement its place, to build its wisdoms, to build its authority, to build its integrity, and play a fundamental and important role in improving the lot of Indigenous people in this country. That's it.
Thank you. The next question that I've got, I'll put to you, Thomas. It's from Linda McIver. We've talked a little bit about the No campaign, but she asks, how do you answer people who feel that the voice is a way to delay or avoid treaty, a way to say that we've done something without doing anything meaningful?
Yeah, I can explain, hopefully in a way that people can use in those discussions. Treaties, there's an argument that some are saying treaties should come first, and I think that's the crux of that argument, and it comes from Senator Thorpe, for example, who strongly says before there's ever a voice, there must be a treaty and truth telling. It's illogical, this argument, firstly because treaties are already underway. In the states and the Northern Territory, the processes have begun. The most advances in Victoria, it's 10 years in, so treaties are already underway. But what is important to consider is that, according to treaty experts, treaties are going to take many decades. They say 30 to 40 years. Senator Thorpe herself has said at least 20 years when I've heard her asked about this in a couple of forums. And so I put this to people: why would you wait an uncertain amount of time for an uncertain outcome? Because treaty is a negotiation. It's not, oh, here's a treaty that's done and dusted. You know, there's a negotiation about what is in a treaty. So why would you wait an uncertain amount of time for an uncertain outcome before we start to address the issues that are common across all of our communities? You know, and I've travelled extensively, and I know these issues are common. You know, housing issues, justice system, you know, how the justice system treats our people and our traumas and our youth. Health, education, employment, you know, infrastructure, quality programs, bringing attention to programs that are wasteful and failing for the cost. These are the things that a voice can do immediately. So why would we wait for a treaty? Secondly, when it comes to treaties are being done with the states and territory, as I said, and we're in a federal system. And so a national body is vital to supporting the treaty processes, you know, establishing a framework. having a conversation with the federal parliament about their obligations to treaties in the states, because it shouldn't be left to the states and the territory alone to deal with this unfinished business in this country. And so I think those are very logical reasons to not wait for a voice. As I said, treaties are underway, but to tackle this now, because we can do more than one thing at once. Lastly, on truth-telling, though, I'll add to this. Truth-telling's been going on for a long time. To wait for a truth-telling process would be similar to, I believe that the parliamentarians, the decision makers already know the truth. Besides the movies and the documentaries, you've got the Closing the Gap reports that they hear every year. They understand the problem. They also have the Royal Commission reports that are chock-a-block full of evidence truth-telling. And so, we could do another a report on the truth, and it would sit and gather dust on their desks like everything else. What's missing is a voice to use the truth to get outcomes. And so it's vital to both treaty making and truth-telling.
A couple of kind of housekeeping questions. I've got a few people asking where my t-shirt is from. I got it from the Uluru Statement from the Heart website. So people can find a whole bunch of different merch, including stickers and other things there if you're interested. Hopefully a quick one. Romaine has asked, will Thomas and Kerry produce an audiobook for people who are vision impaired? I'm not sure if either of you can tell us if that's a possibility.
I'd have to nail Thomas down to do it.
I'm sure
he's spending his life, each day he's in a different part of the country.
I would love to do that. We should talk to the publisher. I don't know if it's possible. I don't think Hardy Grant does audiobooks, but
yeah,
time, Kerry. It only takes, what is it, about an hour and a half to read.
It's just a question of how much time it would take to do it, because we don't have that much time to get it out. But we'll certainly explore it. Yes.
The next question is from Peter Kutsukas, who asks, and I might put this to both of you, does the Sydney Morning Herald polling results this morning concern you? Thomas, I'll throw that one to you first.
No, I'm concerned. I'm always concerned because there's high risk to losing this, It does weigh heavily on all of our minds as Indigenous people, that if we should lose this referendum, then it won't just be the status quo. It's going to take us backwards. It's going to make treaty harder. It's going to make it harder to see resolution to all of these problems, to close the gap. Things are going to get much more difficult. If you could imagine, as a people that have suffered from such great injustice and have been marginalised for so long, to make such a humble and modest proposition that we should be recognised after 60,000 years of continuous connection to this country, and to modestly propose that we just have the opportunity to organise representation so that we can be listened to have that dismissed, what that would do, that always weighs heavily. But the polling isn't what the problem is for me. I know that polling goes up and down. I want us to not panic, but I want us to have urgency. We stick to the plan. We get out there. We tell people how simple this is, that we're not voting on the detail. We're voting on yes or no. Should people be recognised? Should Indigenous people be recognised? And should they have a say? That's what we're saying yes or no to. But get out there and do the hard work. We've done a massive amount of hard work to provide this opportunity to Australians. All those lessons that we learned that go into the Uluru Statement, the hard work that we did to reach the consensus at Uluru, the hard work that we did to not take no for an answer, for 5.5 years until Alvo made this commitment, and the hard work that we're doing now to convince you to walk with us again. Don't waste this opportunity, Australia.
So the other thing to add, Ebony, is that there is a real mobilisation going on already around the country. It's not highly visible because it's taking place at a rather humble community level. It's the whole kitchen table conversation process. There are thousands of volunteers. The target ultimately is to have 50,000 volunteers. I'm not directly connected to the to the campaign, but I do have an understanding of what's going on. You've got every church denomination in the country has signed up in support of the voice. Something like 120 multicultural organisations have signed up in support of the voice. Sporting bodies all over the landscape have signed up at the most grassroots levels and at national levels. Now we await to see how those will manifest in terms of how they make those support expressions count again at the grassroots levels, how active the churches are going to be, how active the multicultural organisations are going to be, and so on. But the other side of this coin is that you've got a relative few, by comparison with the people who are lined up, including pretty much all the major corporates as well. This is an extraordinary, the trade unions, both sides of capital and labour are lined up on this. I mean, there is a sense of unity coming up behind all this. And against this is a relative handful of people who are inciting a polarisation and division in our society, who are muddying the waters deliberately, who are not interested in a genuine and honest discussion and a civil discussion, who do want to scare people and who are, in parts, telling straight lies. There is a process which is inviting Australia's worst side to come out into the public light. That is, those who are driven to one degree or another by prejudice, who feel they now have an excuse, a reason to express some of the ugly things that we're seeing. This is a choice between unity and division. It's really quite clear-cut to me between unity in a civil society and division. And I just hate to think of having to wake up on the morning after this referendum and countenance that we as a nation have voted no and rejected this enormous opportunity to be able to actually stand a little taller and a little straighter, to raise our heads a little higher and look other nations in the eye as we dare to lecture them about their human rights abuses.
Well said. I've got one last question that I think goes to addressing some of the doubts in the community. I've got someone called Catherine who says, from Guigaland, I'm a strong supporter of the voice, but have had people state to me that it is racist. Using the handbook, I've argued that the Constitution was originally racist. And then the conversation continues from there, and they ask, won't this make it more racist? And Thomas, I'm wondering if you've got any advice about how people who are interested in helping the voice can address these kinds of concerns.
Yeah, Indigenous people are proposing this not on the basis of being a different race. I don't believe we are a different race. I believe we're human beings like everyone else. We're approaching this on the basis of being Indigenous people. You know, that as science and our stories both, agree with this long connection to this place, that we have been here for, for so many millennia, that we should be recognised for that. And secondly, ask people if they're aware, and they should be, decisions are made specifically about us as an Indigenous people, okay? And so if decisions are made about us, then wouldn't it be fair for us to have a say? It's not about race. It's about our Indigenous heritage and culture. But then lastly, if we were treated the same, then surely we wouldn't be the most incarcerated people proportionately on the planet. You know, there's a very important part of the Uluru Statement from the heart to ask people to read, let alone the whole thing. You know, that proportionally we're the most incarcerated people on the planet. We're not an innately criminal people, okay? So if the statistics are clear that there's almost 10 years difference in life expectancy, and that these incarceration rates are so bad that in the Northern Territory, almost all of the time, 100% of the youth in detention are Indigenous. If we're not racist, then we must agree that there is a structural and political issue here that we can resolve. And we're proposing the resolution, which is to listen to us. And to believe if it's normal to have those sorts of statistics in itself would be racist. Just finally, the race power in the Constitution, you know, again, 67 didn't remove that. It just made it possible for the federal parliament to use that power. And there's the Hindmarsh case in the 90s. It was determined that that power could be used to our detriment, not necessarily to our benefit. So if it is used about us, then we should have a say.
And very briefly, Ebony, sorry, I think a part of the answer has been supplied to us by the man who Peter Dutton handpicked when he formed his opposition after the last election as leader and put his front bench together, and he handpicked Julian Leeser as his spokesman on Indigenous affairs. And when he announced that he was going to vote no, and he was going to support the no case, he was going to oppose the yes vote in the referendum, Julian Leeser walked away from that cabinet. He walked out of that cabinet. He put his own career on hold, essentially. His predecessor as the Liberal government, the last Liberal government's Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Ken Wyatt, he didn't just, he lost his seat at the last election. He walked out of the Liberal Party in protest at that decision. But Julian Leeser is still in the Parliament, and about 3 weeks ago, in participating in the debate on the form of words for the voice, he said in the clearest possible terms that it would not create two structures. It would not create two Australias. There was no delivery of a particular privilege to Indigenous people as a result of this referendum. And he also said a direct rebuttal of all the claims that the voice will essentially not achieve anything. He said the constitutionally enshrined voice to government and parliament will close the gaps. It will close the gaps. And the truth is, this is Peter Dutton's hand-picked spokesman on Indigenous relations. The truth is, we all of us, have nothing to lose and a great deal to gain by voting yes.
You've taken the words out of my mouth there. The summary to me from this discussion is really our First Nations brothers and sisters have a huge amount to gain from a yes vote at the referendum, and there's nothing to lose for the rest of Australia. This is a very modest proposal. It's inclusive. And hopefully we can get underway with the Yes campaign once Parliament passes the final wording. Thomas, we're going to ask you to recite the Uluru Statement from the Heart for anyone who hasn't listened to it. It's extremely short and sweet in just a second. But for the 2,000 people we've got live with us today, if they want to get involved in the Yes campaign, if they want to help the Yes campaign, or even just to find out more, how can people get involved and do what they can to support Yes?
Yes, so the website is www.yes23.com.au. There is there's a page on there that helps people to find their local supporter groups. And to answer a question, I saw a question from Carrie, C-A-R-I, a while back. Do we start with our street? Yes, start with your streets, and then do your suburbs, and then do your electorate, do your town, start these groups up. You can find groups that are already established on that page, on that website. And on the 2nd of July, there should be a lot of activities across the country. It's a day of action, so look for your local action on the 2nd of July and get involved. There's also merchandise on that website to purchase, and placards and things like that. There's also Together Yes. So it's togetheryes.com.au, which is the kitchen table conversations campaign that Kerry mentioned. A great way to get support, to hold a conversation with around 10 people, around the kitchen table. An excellent way to get involved. And of course, there's this very great book that Kerry and I have written. Small, cheap, hand them out. I've heard about people giving a copy to their uncle, for example, that was going to vote no, that changed his mind after reading it. It's a very simple and short read. So would you like me to recite the statement now, Ebony?
Please do. Here's Thomas Mayo telling us about the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks, Ebony and Kerry. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law in time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That a peoples possess the land for 60 millennia and this sacred link should disappear from world history in merely this last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families, unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish, they will walk into worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of the First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you, Kerry. Thank you for this wonderful book. Just a reminder, the Voice to Parliament Handbook is in all good bookstores. And we've got a link in the chat where you can purchase it on Booktopia. As Thomas said, buy a copy for your friends and family and send it to them. There's a really fantastic chapter with frequently asked questions that'll be useful for all kinds of conversations if you want to get involved in the Yes campaign. And just as an idea about how powerful even this group could be, if everyone who was on this call with us today on this webinar spoke to 10 people, that's 20,000 conversations. That's how easily this thing can spread and how easily you can do your part to help the Yes campaign. Thank you so much for all your wonderful questions today. I'm sorry, as always, that we can't get to all of them, but we do appreciate the time of the wonderful authors, Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien. Thank you for your participation and your interest today. And don't forget, you can check out the video recording of this as well as the audio going up as a podcast on the Australia Institute's channels later today. And thank you everyone for joining us. Please check out all of those links, buy a copy of the book and do what you can to support the Yes campaign for the referendum later this year. Take care of yourselves and we'll see you hopefully at the next webinar. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ebony.
Thank you.